Hello, and thank you for joining this Perspectium webinar titled Putting Your ServiceNow Data to Work. My name is Andrew Pritchard. I'll be your host. I'm the Director of Marketing at Perspectium, and I'll be joined in a little while, but I'd like to introduce Alex Weatherby, who is one of our solution consultants.
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here.
In case you hadn't heard, cloud computing is a thing. Since vendors like Salesforce, Workday, and ServiceNow arrived on the scene about 20 years ago, companies have increasingly been adopting cloud-based applications, delivered and managed as a service, as part of the overall IT infrastructure. It's been hugely beneficial to IT organizations that want the apps, but don't necessarily want the cost and resource of managing those apps. But the adoption of software as a service has created a pretty major challenge in one area, and that's data. ServiceNow and other apps operating in the cloud mean that data is now out of the reach of traditional ETL tools or simple SQL jobs that were the traditional mainstay of DBAs and data warehouse owners. In the past, they could simply grab data from on-premise apps whenever they wanted, but that's just not possible when the data sits in the data center of the vendors that provide and manage the apps. When the app's considered mission critical, like CRM or ERP, the business analytics team will have a major say in how and when data is moved to the data warehouse. But for apps that are important to their function, but not necessarily critical to the overall success of the business, it's more likely that their data will be left out in the cloud. And that means those application owners don't have access to the same BI and analytics tools that generally reside in the data warehouse environment. Gartner refers to this as dark data. Their terminology is information assets that an organization will collect, process, and store during regular business activities, but generally fail to use for other purposes, such as analytics, business relationships, and direct monetizing. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, that's okay because ServiceNow has its own reporting, which is true, it does, for operational information in ServiceNow. But if you're the IT operations leader or an IT executive, you're needing to do deeper analytics. You want to look at the history. You want to be able to predict the future. To how do we best serve the business based on the trends we're seeing and the changes we're seeing across the organization. And those analytics tools, those BI tools, aren't in ServiceNow or any of the SaaS apps. They're in the data warehouse. And increasingly, there's also a move for continuous intelligence. So rather than relying on a daily or weekly batch update where your data is moved from your app to your data warehouse, now people need continuous access to that intelligence. They want to run the reports whenever they want to run the reports and know that they've got the latest information available. The challenge that creates is you suddenly have a lot of data growth and a lot of reporting growth on a production instance of ServiceNow, and they can have production challenges. The performance can start to degrade if you're running heavy analytics all the time. That's actually why you don't do deep analytics against a production instance. Also, with ServiceNow becoming used by many more functions, it's not just IT operations anymore. It's being used by HR, it's being used by facilities, it's being used by security. Well, all of those business owners have their own systems of record, and they're accessing that data through the data warehouse. So they want to know that their IT operations related data for their business function is also available to them, rather than having to go somewhere else to run the reports. So ServiceNow data has to be as accessible as other core applications, but it can't be in a way that is a problem or a challenge for the data warehouse team. The data repository that the reporting is being done from might be departmental, might be corporate. It might be on-premise, or it might be cloud-based. There's a big advance in products like Snowflake or AWS's cloud-based reporting and data warehousing environment. The business function owners don't want to think about different stores. They want to know that all of their data for their function is available to them when it's time to do reporting. So faced with this challenge, like we've got to do it ourselves, that's actually a very common approach. We hear this a lot from our customers. Well, let's just do it ourselves. We'll build our own integration to move data from ServiceNow to wherever the reporting is being done. And that sounds easy when you start. And if all you're doing is a few web service calls and APIs, it's easy to build. But as data volumes grow, that's when the challenges start. You find that what you thought was going to work when you were in dev and test environment, when all of a sudden you've got 10 times more data, 100 times more data than you had tested, performance starts to degrade. Again, running those big reports and doing big data loads using web services and API calls starts to impact the performance of your system. And that's just if you're talking about IT operations data. You know, imagine the ServiceNow environment that's also supporting all those different business functions. We continually hear from our customers that they have underestimated the volume of data they have today, let alone the data volume growth that they'll experience over a 12, 24-month period. Imagine if you're the plumber that builds the pipe. Imagine if you have to rebuild the pipe every time your volumes grow. You may have to put data into a departmental database for reporting. You may have to put data into the corporate data warehouse. It might be on-prem, it might be cloud. It might be you're moving data into other ServiceNow instances. It's likely, again, based on experience we hear from our customers, it's all of the above. And the challenge you've got is if you're responsible for building and maintaining that pipe, do you really want to have to rebuild it every time something grows? Like, would you want to replumb your house every time you have another child or your family grows and starts using more water? Those that start doing it themselves very quickly find this scenario. They are drinking from the hose. And it sounds fun when it starts, but it's really unpleasant once volumes get out of control. So the concept of drinking from a fire hose, and I just had to use an image of pie here because pie, I mean, everyone loves pie. But how do you drink from a fire hose? The first one, with the pie picture, is you're choosy about what you put into the fire hose. You don't put the whole pie in, you just put pieces of the pie in. You put some of your data into the pipe which flows the data where it needs to go. And that's actually good advice no matter what you're doing. If you had unlimited resources, time, and energy, you'd still want to be selective about what data is being moved. You don't move data that doesn't need to be moved. It just adds burden that's unnecessary. But if you've got to segment all that data every single time you're moving data, that becomes a burden. It becomes a workload challenge. So the second approach, which if you're from our US market, you'll be familiar with the ramp meter in the bottom left, is you have stoplights, traffic lights that monitor and manage the flow of data, cars in this analogy, into the data pipe. That's good, as long as you're sure that you can cope with the sudden increase of commute traffic. What happens when your ramp meter can't keep up with the volume of traffic that's trying to get into the freeway or is already on the freeway? It's a challenge, and managing that challenge, again, if this is your job, at peak moments, you've got a lot of effort making sure that your volume of data doesn't start to create data losses. Because will you know you've lost data? Only when someone's complaining they don't have all the data they thought they were going to get. The third approach is you build a reservoir. You manage and buffer the ingress of data by storing it in a huge reservoir and then managing the volume of data that flows through your buffer. The reservoir is the buffer in this scenario. And this is actually an interesting idea. If you've got an infinite amount of buffer, you could send an infinite amount of data through it. And with an infinite amount of time, it will eventually arrive. The challenge and the reality is that we can't really have anything at true infinite scale today. But what we can do is get really, really close. We can get ridiculous amounts of data because cloud elasticity allows us to change the size of the reservoir and the size of the buffer to scale with the needs of the data, the water, again in this analogy. If you've got a good understanding of how much data you have, you know how big your reservoir needs to be. If you know how frequently your reports are going to happen, you know how much data needs to flow through that buffer. The challenge will come but again, when you're caught by surprise, when you realize that your reservoir is actually 10 times bigger than you thought it was going to be, and the demand for data is significantly higher than you thought it was going to be. How do you cope with those variables of the future? Well, there's a combination you can have, and this is actually where Perspectium comes in, is we have the ability to provide you with a regulated method of data ingestion, similar to the ramp meters, and provide managed elastic data reservoir. Scale your data reservoir and scale the ability to flow data without the burden being on you. The technology that we talk about is Perspectium's DataSync technology. And we're going to see that in a few minutes. Where you need to move data, you rely on ServiceNow to manage the application in which the data resides. You may be moving to a model that you rely on Snowflake or AWS to manage the data store into which the data is gone. Perspectium DataSync provides an as-a-service approach to moving that data and automating the management and the creation of the data store and the management of data flowing between your application, ServiceNow, and your data repository. So you've heard me talk for a few minutes. What I'd like to do now is bring Alex in, let's take a look at how DataSync actually works. Let's take a look at how we establish the relationship between ServiceNow and your data store and how that works for you as someone who's responsible for the ServiceNow environment.
Thanks, Andrew.
Tableau is one of the most powerful and user-friendly tools for business intelligence. Extracting ServiceNow data to databases that support Tableau is time-consuming for the person who's responsible for it, and too often doesn't get to the requester quickly enough. Additionally, extractions reduce the overall performance of ServiceNow. In a moment, I'll show you how Perspectium has addressed such issues with its DataSync solution, but first let's see what's possible once you've extracted your ServiceNow data to a database that's connected to Tableau. In this case, we're using MySQL, but DataSync works with a variety of databases and data warehouses such as SAP HANA, Oracle, and Snowflake, to name a few. This is a fairly basic report, but it shows off Tableau's ability to fit a wealth of information into a screen-sized space that's actually pleasing to the eye. This report has incidents listed by their location. A pie chart shows how many incidents there are and what priority each incident is in, with the size of the chart varying depending on how many total incidents there are. In this next example, let's take it a step further. Temporal processing lets us track records as they change over time with valid from and to timestamps. DataSync can support temporal processing even with databases which typically don't, like MySQL in this example. So here we're tracking 1,010 incidents starting on January 1st over a 6-day period. You can see on January 1st, all 1,010 incidents are in a new state. And as we go through the week, their status changes from new to in progress to on hold, resolved, closed, until finally on January 6th, all 1,010 incidents are either in a closed or canceled state. In this case, we used a small sample of just over 1,000 records, but some of Perspectium's customers process over 30 million records daily using DataSync. And that's possible because Perspectium is a native app in ServiceNow that pushes data out from within the platform without using web services. Perspectium's nativity also makes it user-friendly and easy to learn for anybody who's already familiar with ServiceNow. You can see it blends right into the user interface and can be managed entirely within ServiceNow. DataSync supports any out-of-the-box ServiceNow table in addition to custom tables created within a scoped app, and its ability to share in near real time makes Perspectium a great choice for use cases that involve or depend on continuous intelligence. There are a couple of options for sharing data. Bulk shares are executed typically at scheduled intervals or on demand as they're needed, whereas dynamic shares process data in near real time. When creating a new dynamic share, you'll begin by giving it an appropriate name, select the table that you'd like to share from, and set it as active. Here in the tabs below, you can customize further with checkboxes that make it really easy and quick to go through. Here in the trigger conditions, for example, you can choose to share records as they're created, updated, and/or deleted. In filter and enrichment, you can choose to share only updated fields, share only the fields that you've selected, and you can filter based on specific conditions like keywords, category, and impact, for example. You can seed your database initially by running your dynamic share as a bulk share and begin syncing data dynamically from that point on. Perspectium preserves ServiceNow's data schema when syncing to databases like MySQL. And you'll notice that the data is nearly identical structurally, as we go and take a look at that there. But keep in mind that Perspectium can obfuscate fields of your choosing for sensitive information or compliance with GDPR or HIPAA.
Okay, let me stop there because there's a few things you went over in the demo that I've got some questions about. So let's move to question time. The first one is, you said that Perspectium can make any database a temporal database. I think you said temporal, we can negotiate that. Talk a bit more about how we do that.
Yeah, so the DataSync agent can be configured with a temporal directive to compile timestamp snapshots of your ServiceNow data. This will allow users to indicate times when their records data is valid from and when the data is valid to, essentially turning any database into a temporal capable one. So if you're using MySQL, for example, or Oracle, just to name a couple, you're not limited there. You can turn that into a temporal database.
That's good to know. I'm adding that to my discussion topics. And one of the other things, I do a lot of trade shows and events, and one of the things I've heard customers talk about is concerns and issues about moving data with web services because there's no confirmation or guarantee the data actually reaches its intended destination. What do we do to address that?
DataSync can be coupled with a feature called Data Guarantee. And Data Guarantee generates receipts for messages shared from ServiceNow. Message receipts indicate the delivery status for records that you've shared, allowing you to quickly identify successfully shared records versus any records that have yet to be shared out.
Okay, yeah, that's got to be good because it's one thing to send data, but it doesn't really help if it doesn't get there.
Absolutely, and another feature that we offer is to ensure that your queue is processing records. Users can set alerts and warning thresholds for queue connectivity issues and a backlog of records in a queue. So users can monitor subscribed or shared queue by setting thresholds that, when surpassed, will warn or alert.
Excellent, thank you. Do we play a role, or does DataSync play a role in migrations and upgrades for ServiceNow?
Yes, DataSync's ability to update in near real time makes it a useful tool for migrations and upgrades, as users could sync to a subprod instance or database while the production instance is down and replicate to the production instance once it's back online. So this way users don't lose any data during the upgrade or migration.
Okay, and if I'm reading that right, what it also means is that we could probably help with app dev and test by moving production quantities of data into a dev and test environment to make sure that the application architecture you've just built actually works when you put production quantities of data in there.
Absolutely, yeah, and that is a use case that some of our customers use for, and to add to that, they can test with real-time data rather than kind of a stale snapshot.
That's good, I like that. So everything's up and running, everything's working fine, and you need to change the destination of the data source, or the business rules that define when and how data gets moved change. How much coding is involved in making those changes?
None. So that's one of the major advantages of Perspectium being a native app for ServiceNow. Users can actually go in and configure Perspectium through the ServiceNow admin.
Cool. So configuration, not development and coding.
Yes, exactly.
I like that a lot. My coding days are long behind me, so I'm sure lots of customers prefer that. And I'm going to move to this last slide because I love it so much. I always love talking about our customers. You mentioned in the demo that we can move large quantities of data. What kind of examples do you have? When we say large quantities of data, what do we mean?
Hundreds of millions of records a month. Some of our customers, like Accenture, you see there, and ServiceNow, I can tell you're processing 30 million plus records daily. And that's really what DataSync is built for, to handle those types of volumes.
I think that qualifies as large quantities of data. Excellent. Okay, Alex, thank you. Thank you for the demo. Hopefully the viewers find it useful. And thank you for joining us. We do appreciate your participation. There's a lot more information on our website, and we'll be posting more demonstrations and videos like these over the coming weeks and months. So thank you for joining.